Naomi adjusted the thin strap of her borrowed dress and took a steadying breath as she stepped into the grand ballroom. The air smelled of champagne, roses, and the kind of effortless wealth that made people forget problems existed. She kept her head high, scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. The secret to crashing a wedding was confidence. If you acted like you belonged, no one questioned you. And tonight, she belonged, at least until she found someone worth talking to. A string quartet played in the corner, their notes weaving through the laughter and clinking glasses. Chandeliers dripped crystals from the ceiling, catching the golden light. Naomi had seen luxury before, but this was a different level. The type of wedding where the flowers cost more than her rent. The kind where guests arrived in town cars with drivers waiting outside. She adjusted the simple bracelet on her wrist, a habit when she felt out of place, and reminded herself why she was here. Networking. Opportunity. Survival. She didn't crash weddings for fun. That part had started as a joke between her and her best friend, a way to enjoy an open bar and dance to a live band without the awkwardness of knowing the couple. But then Naomi lost her marketing job in a round of budget cuts, and suddenly, what had been a game turned into something necessary. These events were filled with wealthy business owners, executives, and socialites, the kind of people who knew people. If she could make the right connection, land a freelance project, maybe even a full-time job, sneaking in would be worth it. She spotted a group of men in tailored suits standing near the bar, laughing like they had never worried about a bill in their lives. They were the kind of people she needed to meet, the kind who had the power to change someone's future over a round of scotch. She was considering how to casually insert herself into their conversation when a woman with flushed cheeks and an unsteady step latched onto her arm. "You look like someone who believes in love," the woman said, swaying slightly. Naomi turned to find a bridesmaid in a pale blue dress, her curls bouncing with every movement. The woman smelled like expensive perfume and too much champagne. Naomi opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, the bridesmaid tugged her toward the dance floor. "Come on, bouquet toss. It's tradition." Naomi glanced around, looking for an escape. She wasn't about to argue with a drunk bridesmaid in front of 100 people, but this was not part of the plan. "I'm not really." "Nonsense," the bridesmaid interrupted, practically shoving Naomi into a crowd of women. "It's good luck." Naomi barely had time to plant her feet before the bride, a stunning woman in lace and diamonds, turned her back to the group. The crowd behind her buzzed with anticipation. Naomi stood stiffly, hoping the bouquet would land far away so she could slip out without anyone noticing. The bride tossed the flowers into the air. The women around Naomi lunged, arms stretching, voices rising in excitement. Naomi took a step back, letting the chaos unfold in front of her. Then something soft and fragrant smacked against her hands. Silence. She blinked down at the bouquet now cradled against her chest, her fingers curled around the stems. The crowd parted slightly, eyes wide with shock, then a wave of whispers rippled through the room. Naomi's stomach dropped. This was bad. This was very bad. Laughter bubbled out of Naomi before she could stop it. A nervous, startled kind of laugh, the kind that escaped when things were so absurd there was no other reaction available. She was holding a bouquet of white roses and peonies, surrounded by women in pastel dresses who now stared at her as if she had stolen something sacred. Maybe she had. "That was unexpected," she said lightly, glancing around for someone else, anyone else, who might be willing to take the flowers from her hands. "Really, I'm sure there was a more deserving candidate." No one laughed with her. In fact, no one moved at all. The energy in the ballroom had shifted from light-hearted celebration to something much heavier. A strange current ran through the air, a murmur of disbelief and hushed voices passing along a message she wasn't privy to. Then, through the sea of stunned faces, a woman in an emerald green gown moved with startling speed. Older, elegant, the kind of woman whose presence alone demanded attention. Naomi had no idea who she was, but it became clear very quickly that this was someone important. Celeste Sinclair. The bride's mother, apparently, though the way people made space for her suggested she held a position of power beyond a parental role. Her expression was unreadable, but her sharp gaze locked onto Naomi like a hawk spotting something out of place in its territory. "You caught the bouquet," Celeste said, her voice smooth, but there was something in it that made Naomi's skin prickle. "I did," Naomi replied carefully, trying to keep her smile in place. "Total accident. I wasn't even trying." Celeste tilted her head slightly, considering her as though Naomi had just handed over a legal document rather than a handful of flowers. "And yet," Celeste said, "you caught it." Naomi shifted uncomfortably. People were still staring. Even the waitstaff had paused, as if this moment somehow outranked champagne refills. Something wasn't right. "Right," Naomi said slowly. "It's a tradition, isn't it? Whoever catches the bouquet is next in line for marriage?" Celeste gave a small, approving nod. "Precisely." Naomi forced out a polite chuckle, hoping to ease whatever tension had formed. "Well, good news, I'm not even dating anyone, so I think we can safely assume the universe made a mistake on this one." More murmurs. A few exchanged glances. Celeste lifted her chin, and something in her expression changed. Naomi couldn't quite place it, but it sent a warning through her gut. "Well, then," Celeste said smoothly, "allow me to introduce you to my nephew." A hand settled lightly on Naomi's shoulder, just enough weight to make her aware of its presence. She turned, expecting another tipsy wedding guest, maybe a groomsman ready to make a joke at her expense. Instead, she met the cool, steady gaze of Sterling Sinclair. He didn't need an introduction. Even if Celeste hadn't said a word, Naomi would have known exactly who he was. The kind of man who had made a name for himself in magazines, business sections, and whispered conversations over cocktails. Sharp features, dark suit tailored so perfectly it moved with him like a second skin, and the presence of someone who never once had to try to be taken seriously. The groom's cousin. The next eligible bachelor in the Sinclair family. Sterling studied her, his face unreadable, as if he were cataloging details she didn't even know about herself. Naomi tried to laugh again, but this time it came out a little strained. "Okay," she said, still gripping the bouquet. "I think we're missing the part where this is just a fun wedding tradition and not something that actually matters." Sterling didn't react immediately. He didn't look amused, but he also didn't look particularly alarmed. In fact, he looked indifferent. Celeste, however, was anything but indifferent. "Naomi, was it?" she asked, though Naomi had never given her name. Celeste already knew. Naomi nodded warily. Celeste's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "In our family, this tradition is taken quite seriously. The woman who catches the bouquet marries the next unmarried male in the Sinclair line." Naomi blinked. Then blinked again. "I'm sorry, what?" The words were so absurd that for a moment, she thought maybe this was a long-running family joke. A quirky, old-fashioned story they liked to tell new guests before laughing and carrying on with their drinks. No one was laughing. Naomi's grip tightened around the bouquet. "Okay, let's take a step back. I wasn't actually invited to this wedding. So, technically, I shouldn't have even been eligible for whatever this is." Celeste's expression remained composed, as if Naomi had said something unfortunate but irrelevant. "That is of no concern to me," Celeste said. "You caught the bouquet, which means you've fulfilled the requirement." "The requirement for what, exactly?" Celeste's gaze flicked towards Sterling, who had remained silent through all of this, and Naomi suddenly had the very real, very unsettling realization that they were both considering her in a way that felt less like an introduction, more like a transaction. Naomi turned to Sterling, who had yet to say a word. "You're not actually going along with this, are you?" He finally spoke. His voice was deep, calm, controlled. I don't see much point in arguing with my aunt. Naomi gaped at him. That's your response? Celeste interjected before Sterling could say more. You don't have to be concerned, dear. We'll ensure the arrangements are handled properly. There will be no scandal. Naomi stepped back, shaking her head. No scandal? I'm not part of this family. This is insane. Celeste sighed, a faint trace of impatience flickering across her face, as if she had already decided that Naomi was being dramatic. The wedding was a highly publicized event. The press has already seen you catch the bouquet. If you were to walk away now, it would create unnecessary speculation and, quite frankly, embarrassment for the family. Naomi turned back to Sterling, grasping for a lifeline in this madness. Tell me you don't actually believe this is happening. Sterling's eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. I believe my aunt has made her position very clear. Naomi let out a breath, trying to ground herself. Okay, well, my position is also clear. I'm not marrying a total stranger because of some archaic rule no one should be following in the first place. Celeste didn't flinch. Tradition is not something we break. Naomi had no idea how to argue with that level of certainty. How did a person even respond to being told they had accidentally signed themselves up for a marriage? She had crashed a wedding expecting nothing more than an open bar and maybe a networking opportunity. And now, she was standing in the middle of a ballroom, holding a bouquet like it was a contract she had somehow agreed to by simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She dropped the flowers onto the nearest table. Then consider this tradition broken. Naomi barely had time to process what was happening before she was guided, no, escorted, out of the ballroom. Celeste's grip on her arm had been firm, and when Naomi tried to protest, she was met with a reassuring but utterly immovable wall of polite authority. Within minutes, she was being ushered into the back of a sleek black car, its leather seats swallowing her whole. Sterling slid in beside her without a word, and before she could demand to be let out, the doors locked and the car pulled away from the hotel. This is kidnapping, she muttered, crossing her arms. Sterling, who had been checking his phone, glanced at her. You got in willingly. I was pushed. He didn't argue, which annoyed her even more. She turned toward the window, watching as city lights blurred past, her mind scrambling for an exit plan. This had to be a bad dream. Maybe she was still at the wedding, and soon she'd wake up in her borrowed dress, laughing it all off with her friend. Except the cold air from the car's vents felt real. The weight of the night's absurdity pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. The drive stretched into silence, Sterling focused on whatever crisis was unfolding on his phone. Naomi stole a glance at him, irritated by how unfazed he seemed. The kind of man who handled everything with the same measured indifference, whether it was a hostile corporate takeover or a stranger being forced into his life. She cleared her throat. Are you always this calm when being forced into marriage? He barely looked up. I wouldn't say forced. She threw up her hands. Oh, no, of course not. You're just having a lovely evening, and this is a totally normal Tuesday for you. The corner of his mouth twitched, but before he could respond, the car slowed, pulling up to an estate that made Naomi's stomach drop. The mansion, because calling it a house would be like calling the ocean a puddle, loomed behind an iron gate, its massive windows glowing against the night. Perfectly manicured hedges lined the driveway, leading up to an entrance grand enough to belong to royalty. Of course, she muttered. Of course you live in a villain's lair. Sterling didn't acknowledge that. The gates opened smoothly, and as the car came to a stop, a team of staff moved into position, opening doors, gathering bags she didn't own, nodding in quiet efficiency. Naomi stepped out cautiously, half expecting someone to drag her inside if she hesitated too long. Right this way, Miss Clark, a man in a sharp suit said, gesturing toward the entrance. Sterling was already striding ahead, as if he had forgotten she existed. Naomi stood still for a moment, debating whether to turn around and sprint down the driveway. But then the reality of her situation settled in. Where would she go? Celeste had made it abundantly clear that this wasn't up for debate. If she left now, they'd find another way to bring her back. With a deep breath, she followed. Inside, the house was even more overwhelming. High ceilings, marble floors, chandeliers that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned combined. The kind of place designed to make people feel small. Naomi glanced at a gilded mirror hanging in the hallway and barely recognized the woman staring back at her, disheveled hair, slightly smudged makeup, wide eyes filled with disbelief. A voice broke through her daze. "This is incredible." Naomi turned to find a man watching her, arms crossed over his chest, amusement written all over his face. Unlike Sterling, who carried an air of cool detachment, this man looked at her like he'd just stumbled upon the most entertaining thing he'd seen all year. He had the same sharp Sinclair features but with a looseness Sterling lacked, his dark hair slightly tousled, his smile easy. "Harrison Sinclair," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "The more charming sibling." Naomi hesitated, then shook it, her grip still tense. "You're taking this well," she noted. "Oh, I think it's hilarious," Harrison admitted. "I mean, my brother is marrying a total stranger because our aunt willed it into existence? That's comedy gold." She narrowed her eyes. "Good to know my impending doom is entertaining. You don't have to sound so dramatic." She threw her hands up. "I was kidnapped." Harrison grinned. "Kidnapped in a luxury car and dropped off at a mansion?" The horror. Sterling reappeared then, his presence dousing the moment like cold water. "Harrison, stop bothering her." "I was just welcoming your new fiancé," Harrison said innocently. "You should be thanking me." Sterling ignored him and turned to Naomi. "The lawyers are waiting." Naomi followed him down a hallway that felt like it stretched forever. Sterling led her into an office, where two men in dark suits sat with thick stacks of papers in front of them. One of them stood and adjusted his glasses. "Miss Clark, we've prepared the agreement." Naomi eyed the stack. "That looks more intense than an actual marriage license." Sterling sat across from her, hands clasped, his gaze unreadable. "It outlines the terms." She exhaled slowly. "Terms. No intimacy," the lawyer said, flipping to a highlighted section. "No romantic expectations. 1 year of marriage, after which an official divorce will be filed with all necessary settlements in place." She skimmed the page in front of her, fingers tightening around the pen that had been placed beside the document. "And if I refuse?" The lawyer hesitated before answering. "It would be unadvisable." Which, Naomi translated, meant that Celeste would make her life miserable. Her eyes met Sterling's. "And this is fine with you?" His expression didn't change. "It's a solution." That irritated her more than anything else. A solution to what, exactly? His silence was enough of an answer. Naomi didn't know why a man like him needed this arrangement, but she wasn't naive enough to believe it was just about family tradition. There was more to this. There had to be. But she also knew she had no real choice. She glanced at Harrison, who gave her an exaggerated thumbs up. Sterling remained unreadable. The lawyers waited patiently. With a sigh, Naomi picked up the pen. "Fine," she said, pressing it to the paper. 1 year. Naomi stared at her reflection in the mirror, tugging at the edges of the dress that had been delivered to her that morning. It was beautiful in an almost aggressive way, champagne-colored silk, off-the-shoulder sleeves, the kind of gown designed to make a statement. The problem was, she had no idea what that statement was supposed to be. There was a knock at the door. One of Sterling's ever-efficient staff members peeked in. "The car is ready, Miss Clark." Miss Clark. Like she was some kind of dignitary instead of an unwilling participant in the world's most ridiculous arrangement. She took one last breath before stepping out into the cavernous foyer, where Sterling was waiting. He was already dressed in a black tuxedo, looking exactly as he always did, composed, distant, impossible to read. He glanced at her for all of 2 seconds before nodding. "It'll do," he said. Naomi narrowed her eyes. "Oh, thank God. I was hoping for validation from a man who treats human interaction like a quarterly financial report." His mouth twitched slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gestured toward the door, already moving as if he knew she'd follow. The drive to the gala was quiet. Naomi pretended to be fascinated by the city lights flashing past the tinted windows, but her nerves were growing with each passing mile. She had never been to an event like this. The closest she had come was crashing a few upscale weddings, but this wasn't the kind of place where she could blend into the background. This was an arena. The car pulled up to the venue, where photographers and journalists were already gathered. Naomi's stomach tightened at the sight of flashing cameras and reporters angling to get the first glimpse of whatever elite guest was arriving next. Sterling turned to her. "You'll be fine. That's easy for you to say." She gestured to his face. "You were practically engineered in a lab for situations like this." He smirked. "Just smile and stay close." The car door opened, and suddenly there was no more time to prepare. The moment Sterling stepped out, a wave of camera flashes lit up the night. Naomi hesitated for a split second before taking his extended hand and stepping into the chaos. The moment her heels hit the pavement, the questions started. "Sterling, how did you two meet?" "Naomi, how does it feel to be engaged to one of the most powerful men in the country?" "Sterling, is this a love match or a business move?" Sterling ignored them, offering his arm. Naomi hesitated before looping hers through his, letting him guide her up the grand entrance steps. He was cool under pressure, completely at ease, his expression giving away nothing. She, on the other hand, could feel the tension creeping into her shoulders, the weight of every camera lens dissecting her every move. Inside, the ballroom was even more intimidating than she had feared. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over a sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits. Servers weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and the air buzzed with polite, measured conversation. Sterling navigated the room with ease, greeting people with the efficiency of someone who had done this a million times. Naomi stuck close, her grip tightening slightly on his arm as she tried to keep up. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "Really?" "Because I feel like a houseplant someone accidentally brought to a wedding." He didn't respond, just guided her toward an older couple who were clearly expecting an introduction. "Sterling, always a pleasure," the man said, offering a firm handshake. His wife's gaze slid over to Naomi with a polite but assessing expression. "Likewise," Sterling said smoothly. "This is Naomi." Naomi forced a smile, repeating her own name back as if that added anything of value. "And what do you do, dear?" the woman asked, in that tone reserved for people who had never worried about bills a day in their lives. Naomi opened her mouth, then realized she had no good answer. Unemployed wedding crasher wasn't exactly a confidence booster in these circles. "She's between projects," Sterling said easily, saving her from scrambling. "But I'm sure that won't last long." The couple exchanged a knowing glance, and Naomi suddenly wanted to evaporate. As the night wore on, the pattern continued. Sterling made introductions, people assessed her, she smiled and nodded, and then they moved on. It was a well-oiled machine, and she was simply another gear turning along with it. At one point, she slipped away for a moment, pretending to be fascinated by a sculpture in the corner just to give herself a second to breathe. "She won't last." The voice came from behind her, soft but cutting. Naomi turned slightly, just enough to see a group of women nearby, sipping champagne and watching her like a mildly interesting science experiment. "She's just another business deal," one of them said, lips curving into a knowing smirk. Naomi's fingers clenched around the stem of her glass. She's pretty, though, another added, as if that was some small consolation. Maybe he'll keep her around for a while before moving on to something more suitable. Naomi set her glass down before she did something regrettable, like throwing it at someone's head. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at the marble floor, willing herself to let it go. You should stop eavesdropping. Sterling's voice was low beside her. She turned to find him watching her, expression unreadable. I wasn't eavesdropping, she muttered. They were talking at a volume that suggested they wanted me to hear. He didn't argue. He just glanced over at the group, and though he didn't say a word, the shift in his gaze was enough. The women went silent, then quickly turned back to their drinks. Naomi exhaled slowly. I don't like this. I know. She looked at him, frustrated. Then why are we here? Because people like this love a performance. And if you want them to stop seeing you as a business deal, you have to play the part better than they do. She hated that he was right. Still, as the night dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how well she played her role, she would never be one of them. Naomi stood in the bridal suite of a hotel so expensive that even the air smelled expensive. A team of stylists hovered around her, adjusting, fluffing, tweaking, pulling at the waist of her designer gown, smoothing her hair, dabbing at non-existent imperfections on her face. It had been hours of this. Hours of people perfecting her, sculpting her into the image of a bride worthy of marrying a Sinclair. The dress was exquisite, of course. Silk that clung in all the right places, lace so delicate it looked painted on. It was a gown made for a woman who had always imagined this moment, dreamed of it since childhood. Naomi had never been that woman. A reflection of herself stared back at her in the mirror, elegant, poised, stunning. A woman about to marry a billionaire. A woman about to step into a life she didn't understand. Ready? One of the stylists asked. Ready. What a ridiculous question. The wedding was an orchestrated spectacle, a masterpiece of wealth and influence. The Sinclair name meant that no detail could be anything less than perfection. The venue, a sprawling estate with cathedral-high ceilings and gardens straight out of a fairy tale, was filled with an audience of socialites, celebrities, and business tycoons. People who had flown in from across the world, not because they cared about the union, but because this was the kind of event that mattered to them. Naomi wasn't sure how she got to the doors of the ceremony. One moment, she was in the bridal suite, the next, she was standing there, her arm looped through Harrison's. Of course Sterling hadn't offered to walk her himself. Harrison grinned at her, looking far too amused for someone about to escort a woman to a marriage she had barely agreed to. You look fantastic, he said. Like you've been planning this your whole life. She shot him a look. I will push you into the cake. He chuckled, unbothered. Save it for the reception. The doors swung open. The crowd turned. The music swelled, rich and opulent, the kind of thing meant to stir emotion, to mark the beginning of something profound. Naomi forced herself to breathe. Sterling stood at the end of the aisle, a vision of polished restraint in his tailored black suit. His expression was unreadable, his posture perfect. He looked every bit the man who had never once been rattled by anything in his life. Naomi took a step forward, then another. She was hyper-aware of everything, the weight of the dress, the way hundreds of eyes were glued to her, the cameras discreetly capturing every second. There was no turning back. Sterling extended his hand as she reached him, his grip steady and cool. They faced each other, the officiant clearing his throat before launching into the vows. It was a blur, a string of carefully chosen words, promises that had no meaning. She repeated them, as did he, their voices calm and even. Then, just as she was about to retreat into the safety of indifference, she caught something in his eyes. A flicker of something, real. Gone as quickly as it had come. It threw her off balance, a split second of doubt in the middle of a script. Then the officiant was declaring them husband and wife, and before she could process any of it, Sterling's hand was on her waist, pulling her in. The kiss was precisely what it needed to be. Public, practiced, the kind of thing that would look perfect on the front pages tomorrow. Sterling knew how to perform. His lips were firm against hers, not rushed, not hesitant, but perfectly measured. The crowd erupted into applause, camera shutters clicking in a rapid chorus. It was everything a kiss was supposed to be. And yet, as it ended and Sterling pulled away, Naomi felt the weight of something much heavier settle in her chest. The weight of knowing that, despite the applause and the pictures, none of this was real. Naomi dragged her suitcase through the massive front doors, the sound of the wheels rolling over marble the only indication that she was even there. The house, or rather, the architectural statement Sterling called home, was everything she had expected. Towering glass walls, sleek black and white furniture, not a single unnecessary object in sight. It wasn't a home. It was a museum of wealth and restraint. A butler she hadn't been introduced to took her bag before disappearing down a hall without a word. She stood in the entryway, feeling absurdly like a guest who had arrived too early to a party that no one had actually invited her to. Footsteps echoed down the grand staircase. Sterling. He had changed from his wedding tux into a crisp dress shirt and dark slacks, looking as put together as ever. He barely glanced at her as he walked past. "There's a room prepared for you on the east wing," he said, already moving toward what she assumed was his office. Naomi folded her arms. "A room?" He stopped, turning slightly. "Yes. Not our room." His expression didn't shift. "That won't be necessary." Of course it wouldn't. She exhaled slowly, reminding herself that she had agreed to this. It wasn't as if she had expected some grand honeymoon suite situation, but something about the casual way he dismissed the idea of even pretending to share a space made her feel ridiculous. "Great," she muttered. Nothing says marriage like separate wings. If he heard her, he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he nodded once, as if this conversation had been a successful transaction, then disappeared into his office, shutting the door behind him. Naomi was left standing there, still wearing the expensive heels from the wedding, still slightly dizzy from the champagne she'd barely touched at the reception, and now fully aware that she was alone in a house with a man who treated her like a corporate merger. She followed the direction Sterling had indicated, wandering through hallways so long she half expected to find herself in a different time zone by the time she reached her destination. The room was as beautiful as the rest of the house, neutral tones, clean lines, enormous windows. It was the kind of bedroom you'd see in a magazine spread titled Minimalism and Power, but there was nothing personal about it. No warmth. No signs that anyone had ever truly lived here. She kicked off her shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, pressing her fingers to her temples. This was fine. This was what she had agreed to. She just had to get through the year. By the second day, Naomi noticed that the staff barely spoke to her. It wasn't rudeness, exactly. They weren't dismissive or impolite. But there was a quiet efficiency to the way they worked, slipping in and out of rooms like ghosts, cleaning things that didn't seem to need cleaning, restocking items before she even realized they were missing. At breakfast, a meal was prepared and waiting for her, but no one asked what she wanted. At lunch, a staff member placed a tea on the table beside her without making eye contact. By dinner, she realized that even though the house was filled with people, she had never felt more alone in her life. She barely saw Sterling. He woke up early and left for work before she was even out of bed. If he came home at all, it was long after she had already retreated to her room. The only indication that he even lived there was the occasional glimpse of his tailored suits disappearing into the study or the sound of his voice, low and controlled, on business calls that carried through the halls. After 3 days of this, Naomi decided she was done trying to make sense of it. If Sterling wanted to act like they were nothing more than strangers with a shared legal agreement, that was fine. She could do that. She found ways to occupy herself, morning walks around the sprawling estate, reading in the enormous library that she doubted Sterling had ever actually used, binge-watching reality shows on the kind of television screen that made it feel like the contestants were in the room with her. She ignored the emptiness of the house, ignored the way she sometimes caught herself listening for signs of life. She reminded herself that this was temporary. She just had to survive the year. Naomi had always believed she was meant for something bigger. Not in a grand, destined for stardom kind of way, but in the way a person believes that if they just work hard enough, push through long enough, something will eventually give. Some break will finally come. She grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like fabric softener and whatever her mother was cooking that week. Her mom worked long hours as a nurse, always exhausted but always moving. Her dad had left when she was 7, a blur of broken promises and a goodbye note that her mother had shredded into pieces before Naomi could read it. She never asked what it said. She spent her childhood believing she had to be twice as determined as anyone else if she wanted to make something of herself. And she had been. The best grades, the most extracurriculars, the internships that didn't pay a cent but promised experience. She checked every box. Did everything she was supposed to do. And still, life never quite unfolded the way she imagined. She had landed her first real job at a mid-size marketing agency straight out of college. The pay wasn't great, but it was a start. She worked late, took on extra projects, made herself indispensable, until she wasn't. A corporate merger, a round of budget cuts, and suddenly, she was standing in a conference room with a folder full of severance paperwork and a boss who looked vaguely apologetic but mostly impatient to move on to the next name on the list. After that, everything unraveled faster than she could patch it back together. She applied for jobs, sent out resumes that disappeared into the void, took freelance gigs when she could find them, but nothing stuck. She had just enough savings to scrape by until she didn't. Then it was couch surfing, friends at first, then friends of friends. That was around the time Riley had suggested the wedding idea. "You need to get out," Riley had said one evening as they sat on the floor of her tiny studio apartment, eating dollar-slice pizza. "You look like a Victorian child recovering from an illness." Naomi threw a crust at her. "Not all of us have disposable incomes, Riley." "Exactly my point. I know a place we can go this weekend. Fancy hotel, open bar, free food. It's a wedding. We'll blend right in." Naomi had given her a look. "We are not crashing a wedding." Riley had shrugged. "Suit yourself, but I hear they have filet mignon." It had been a joke. A ridiculous, slightly unethical joke. But Riley had a way of making things sound like adventures instead of bad decisions. So they went. It was surprisingly easy. Wear a nice dress, smile at the right moments, act like you belonged. No one questioned them. They drank expensive champagne, danced with strangers, made up elaborate backstories about how they knew the couple. It was fun. Harmless. Then Naomi had realized something. These weddings weren't just parties. They were networking goldmines. The kind of places where powerful people gathered, their guards down, their pockets open. She didn't belong to their world, but for a few hours, she could pretend. And if she happened to have a conversation with a CEO who needed a marketing consultant or a socialite with a brand looking for a fresh campaign, what was the harm in that? It wasn't a long-term plan. Just something to get her through until she found a real job. But then came this wedding. The one where she had been minding her own business, drinking a very nice cocktail, when some overenthusiastic bridesmaid had shoved her into the bouquet toss. The one where she had caught the flowers without meaning to. The one where she had been introduced to Sterling Sinclair, handed a ridiculous family tradition, and before she could process what was happening, she had been whisked into a life she had no business being in. She had been looking for an opportunity. She never expected it to be this. Sterling had never been the kind of child people worried about. He was quiet, self-sufficient, unervingly mature for his age. The kind of kid who never threw tantrums, never caused trouble, never did anything unpredictable. Other parents envied his mother, telling her how lucky she was to have a son so disciplined, so serious, so controlled. What they didn't see was the way he sat alone at recess, reading books on economics while the other kids played tag. Or how, at family gatherings, he positioned himself near the adults, listening to their conversations about business and power instead of running around with his cousins. He was polite, distant, and even at 10 years old, he understood that relationships, friendships, emotions, attachments, were distractions. It wasn't that he didn't like people. He just never saw the point in them. While other kids dreamed of becoming astronauts or rock stars, Sterling dreamed in spreadsheets and balance sheets. He asked for business biographies for Christmas, devoured case studies before bed, and mapped out his career before he was even legally allowed to open a bank account. By 15, he was interning at his uncle's company, sitting in meetings with executives who barely noticed him but whose every word he absorbed. By 19, he was running small investment portfolios, making decisions that shocked even seasoned analysts. By 25, he had built his own empire. Success came easily. People, however, did not. Relationships required effort, unpredictability, compromises. None of those things fit neatly into his world. He had tried, briefly, in his 20s, dating women who were beautiful and intelligent, women who should have made sense on paper. It always started the same way. They admired his ambition, found his focus attractive. They told him they liked his seriousness, his discipline, the way he carried himself like someone who had already won. Then, inevitably, they wanted more. More time, more attention, more of him. And that was where it always fell apart. He was busy. He was building something. He didn't have time for long, meandering phone calls or spontaneous weekend trips. He responded to texts hours late, missed dinners, left messages unread because he was in meetings, because he was working, because his focus had always been on something bigger. At first, they were patient. Then, they were frustrated. Eventually, they left. Some did it quietly, slipping out of his life with nothing more than a short, resigned conversation. Others made a scene, calling him cold, detached, a man incapable of love. He never fought them on it. Never tried to prove them wrong. They weren't wrong. He didn't need love. He needed efficiency. Control. A life that made sense. So when his aunt presented him with a problem, a ridiculous family tradition that dictated he needed to marry in order to secure certain assets, he approached it the same way he approached any challenge. Logically. This wasn't about romance. It was about securing his future. A contract, an agreement, a clean-cut solution to an inconvenient problem. That was the plan. Then Naomi caught the bouquet. And suddenly, what was supposed to be simple had turned into something else entirely. Naomi had never lived with a robot before, but she imagined this was what it would be like. Sterling moved through his home like someone following an invisible schedule, his actions precise, his time accounted for down to the second. He woke up at exactly 5:30 every morning. Not 5:29, not 5:31. By 5:45, he was in the gym. By 6:30, he was showered and dressed in one of what appeared to be 1,000 identical suits. At 7 o'clock, a staff member placed a black coffee, always black, no sugar, no milk, on the dining table. He read the news for exactly 15 minutes. Then he left for the office. Naomi wasn't sure what unnerved her more, his lack of deviation or the fact that, despite everything, she had started keeping track. It wasn't on purpose. She wasn't interested. But when you lived in the same house as someone whose movements were as predictable as a metronome, it was impossible not to notice. She had started anticipating the sound of his footsteps as he left his room, recognizing the way he barely acknowledged anyone in the morning because his mind was already elsewhere. She, on the other hand, had no schedule. No real purpose. She woke up when she wanted. Ate when she remembered. avoided the endless, empty rooms of the house and spent most of her time in the library, pretending to read but mostly just existing in the space she was supposed to call home. They barely spoke. When they did, it was polite but distant. A passing nod in the hallway. A short exchange at breakfast, usually consisting of him saying, "Morning," and her responding, "You do realize you don't have to acknowledge my existence, right?" The staff were more like him than they were like her. They operated quietly, seamlessly. They didn't ask questions, didn't try to make small talk. It was like living in a museum where all the exhibits moved around you, but no one ever truly saw you. One night, restless and unable to sleep, she wandered down one of the many hallways of the house. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she wasn't used to this much silence. At her friend Riley's apartment, there had always been noise, music playing, a neighbor shouting, the comforting hum of city life seeping through the windows. Here, everything was still. She found herself in a room she hadn't seen before, smaller than the others, tucked away near his office. It wasn't decorated like the rest of the house. No sterile white walls or impersonal art. Instead, shelves lined the walls, filled with books and, oddly enough, rows of neatly arranged figurines. Star Wars. Naomi blinked, stepping closer. The collection was extensive. Models of ships, characters, entire dioramas of battle scenes. Some still in their original packaging, others displayed carefully. It didn't fit. Not with everything else she knew about him. She reached out, picking up a small, detailed model of the Millennium Falcon. "That one's from 1980. She jumped, nearly dropping it. Sterling stood in the doorway, watching her with that unreadable expression he always wore. "You should wear a bell," she muttered, placing the ship back on the shelf. His lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "You're in my study." She crossed her arms. "I thought it was a museum exhibit." He stepped inside, glancing at the shelves. "Most people don't expect this." "No kidding." She gestured at the collection. "I thought your hobby was controlling financial markets." "I contain multitudes." She huffed a quiet laugh, looking at the figures again. "So, what's the deal? You have an emotional attachment to space wizards?" "Something like that." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't leave either. She turned back to the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines of old books stacked beside the figures. Then, without thinking, she said, "Empire Strikes Back is the best one." He stilled. "You think so?" She looked over at him, surprised at the way he was suddenly paying attention. Real attention, like she had said something actually worth discussing. "Of course," she said. "It's the perfect middle chapter. It's darker, the stakes are higher, the villain wins. And the romance isn't obnoxious. It's the most well-constructed of the originals," he finished. She narrowed her eyes. "Wait. Is that your favorite too?" For the first time since she had met him, Sterling looked almost human. "It is." Something shifted. Just for a second. A flicker of something she couldn't name. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He cleared his throat, stepping back. "It's late," he said, "all business again. You should get some sleep." Naomi watched as he walked away, disappearing into the hallway. She looked back at the collection, at the tiny model of the Falcon still sitting exactly where she had placed it. It was just a movie. Just a tiny, meaningless overlap in their separate, carefully constructed lives. But still, it was something. The first time Sterling actually spoke to her over breakfast, Naomi nearly choked on her coffee. It had been weeks of sitting across from each other at the long, impossibly polished dining table in complete silence. Sterling read the news, scrolled through his phone, and existed in the detached, almost mechanical way he always did. She occupied herself by experimenting with how many pastries she could eat before he looked mildly disapproving. It had been a quiet, peaceful arrangement. Then, one morning, as she reached for the butter, he said, "Do you always use that much on your toast?" Naomi froze, her knife hovering over the slice of bread. "Excuse me?" Sterling barely glanced up from his phone. "It's a lot of butter." She narrowed her eyes, setting the knife down with a dramatic clink. "Did you just speak to me?" Unprompted. He turned a page of the newspaper, unmoved. "You're in my house." It was bound to happen eventually. Naomi studied him for a moment, debating whether or not to take offense. Instead, she picked up the toast, took an exaggerated bite, and chewed slowly. "Butter is the best part of toast. If anything, I should be using more." Sterling sighed, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's ridiculous." "What's ridiculous is eating dry toast like a Victorian orphan." "I don't eat dry toast." "You eat it with just a whisper of butter." "It's the same thing." He shook his head and went back to his reading. The next morning, his usual breakfast was on the table: coffee, scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast. This time, the butter was already generously spread. It started like that. Tiny moments, barely noticeable shifts in their strange little household dynamic. One afternoon, Naomi was curled up in the library with a book when she heard him walk in. She ignored him, expecting him to grab something and leave, but he lingered. After a long pause, he asked, "Is it good?" She looked up, surprised. "What?" "The book." She turned it over in her hands, weighing her answer. "It's fine. You've been reading it for 3 days." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you monitoring my reading habits?" Sterling ignored the question. "What's it about?" Naomi hesitated. It was an obscure travel memoir she had picked up on a whim, written by a journalist who had spent a year living in different countries, experiencing local cultures and disasters alike. "A guy moves somewhere new every month," she said. "Gets in trouble a lot. Learns things. Drinks questionable alcohol." Sterling's mouth twitched slightly. "Sounds irresponsible." "Sounds like a person who actually lives their life," she countered. "Some people enjoy the occasional adventure." He leaned against the doorframe. "I travel plenty." She scoffed. "Business trips don't count. You probably spend the whole time in boardrooms and private cars, never even seeing the city." Sterling didn't argue, which meant she was right. A few days later, when she came down for breakfast, there was a book on the table next to her plate. A travel memoir. She stared at it, then at Sterling, who was calmly sipping his coffee as if nothing had changed. She slid into her seat, flipping through the pages. "This is what, an experiment? You seem to think I don't know how to enjoy things." Naomi smirked. "So you're trying to prove a point?" "I'm trying to eat breakfast," he corrected. But she caught the flicker of something else. A challenge, maybe. Or curiosity. Their conversations were never long. Never deep. Just small exchanges over coffee, comments made in passing. But they happened. Sometimes, he asked about her work, what she had done before this, if she ever planned on working again. She found herself talking about old projects, about ideas she never got to execute, about the strange satisfaction of finding the perfect tagline for a campaign. He listened. Not just the polite, absent-minded way people listened when they were waiting for their turn to speak, but actually listened. Other times, she asked about his company, trying to understand what it was he spent his life obsessing over. He never spoke about it the way she expected. No self-importance, no grand speeches about power or legacy. Just a quiet, steady certainty. "I like knowing the next move before anyone else does," he admitted once. "That's all business is, really. Understanding people. Predicting them." Naomi had laughed. "That's funny, considering you have 0 social skills." Sterling just sipped his coffee, unfazed. The strange thing was, she didn't feel awkward around him anymore. It wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it was no longer suffocating. She still felt like an outsider in his world, a temporary fixture in a house that didn't belong to her. But at least now, when they sat across from each other at breakfast, it didn't feel quite so empty. Naomi's phone was vibrating so aggressively it nearly fell off the nightstand. She groaned, reaching blindly for it, her brain still fogged with sleep. The screen was a mess of notifications, texts, missed calls, unread emails, but it was the sheer number of alerts from apps she barely used that made her stomach tighten. She squinted at the screen. Thousands of new followers. Thousands of comments. Her chest went cold. That was never a good thing. She opened one of the notifications, and the second she saw her own face staring back at her from a news article, nausea curled in her stomach. Sterling Sinclair's mysterious bride, the gold digger who snagged the billionaire. Naomi sat up so fast the blankets tangled around her legs. She scrolled down, skimming the article at breakneck speed. It was all there, her name, her past, the fact that no one had ever heard of her before this so-called whirlwind romance. Then the real punch to the gut. It was never about love, Camille Laurent, Sinclair's former fiancée, tells us. Naomi Clark isn't his wife. She's a business deal. The article went on to detail how Naomi had allegedly maneuvered her way into Sterling's life, portraying her as an opportunist who had somehow tricked him into a contract marriage for financial gain. A contract. The very thing she had hoped would stay buried under layers of legal discretion was now out in the open for the entire world to dissect. She switched to Twitter, and instantly regretted it. Her name was trending. Gold digger. Scammer. Fake wife. Pathetic social climber. Some tweets were worse than others. Some were brutal. Imagine selling your dignity for a paycheck. She couldn't even be a decent trophy wife. Sterling's ex was stunning. This girl? Laughable. Naomi Clark finessed her way into a billionaire's bed and thinks we're dumb enough to believe it was love. It was endless. A constant, unfiltered stream of strangers picking apart every piece of her existence. She scrolled through Instagram. People had dug up old photos, grainy shots from college, a blurry picture from a friend's birthday party 5 years ago, twisting every detail to fit the narrative Camille had handed them. The worst part? She barely even had social media before this. She had never been someone who curated an online presence, never cared about gaining followers or posting perfect selfies. But now, somehow, the internet had assigned her a persona, and it didn't matter who she really was. They had already decided. Her hands were shaking. The sound of footsteps in the hall snapped her out of it. She turned just as the bedroom door opened, and Sterling walked in, already dressed, already perfect, like nothing had changed. Except everything had. She held up her phone. Did you see this? His expression didn't flicker. I saw. That was it. No shock. No reaction. Naomi felt a sudden, burning frustration rise in her throat. Of course you did, she said, voice tight. Because this is normal for you, isn't it? Scandals. Headlines. People tearing each other apart in the media like it's a sport. He studied her, unreadable as always. She let out a harsh laugh, shaking her head. I don't know why I'm surprised. You probably have a whole team handling this already, right? Some PR specialist drafting a statement? A lawyer making sure Camille doesn't say anything that can actually get her sued? He didn't deny it. Naomi exhaled, her fingers gripping the edge of the phone like she wanted to throw it. I don't care what people think about me, she said, and she almost believed it. I don't care if your ex wants to spread whatever version of the truth makes her feel better. But. She hesitated, because the words tasted bitter. But? Sterling prompted. She swallowed. I didn't think it would feel like this. She had always been on the outside of these kinds of scandals. She had watched them play out in tabloids, seen actresses and socialites get torn apart by the public, their lives becoming entertainment for people with nothing better to do. She had never thought about how it felt to be the person on the other side of it. To feel like you were being erased and rewritten by people who had never met you. Sterling finally moved, stepping closer, his gaze sharper now. "It will die down," he said. His voice was steady, unshaken. The way he said it, it almost sounded like a fact. But Naomi wasn't so sure. She set the phone down on the nightstand, staring at it like it was something dangerous. For the first time since she stepped into Sterling's world, she felt like she had truly lost control of her own. Naomi sat curled up on the couch, staring at her phone like it was something toxic. The screen was still glowing, another wave of notifications flashing in the corner, but she wasn't reading them anymore. She had seen enough. She had scrolled until the words blurred, until they no longer felt like they belonged to her. She hovered her finger over the settings, then exhaled sharply and pressed the button. Delete account? Yes. The screen went blank, a final confirmation that she had wiped herself clean from the internet, at least for now. The world could keep screaming about her, but she wouldn't hear it anymore. It didn't help as much as she thought it would. She tossed her phone onto the coffee table, pressing her palms against her eyes. She was exhausted. Not just the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that settled into your bones, making everything feel heavier. She didn't hear Sterling come in. She only noticed him when she looked up and found him standing a few feet away, watching her. His tie was already loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, like he had just come home from another endless day of running the world. But there was something different in the way he looked at her. Less detached. Less composed. His eyes flicked to her phone, then back to her face. "You deleted it." She let out a tired laugh. Figured it was easier than throwing it out a window. He didn't smile, but he did something else. He hesitated. Just for a second. A flicker of uncertainty, the slightest crack in his usual unreadable demeanor. Then, without thinking, he said, "Have dinner with me." Naomi blinked. "What?" Sterling cleared his throat, already looking like he regretted it. "Dinner. With me." She stared at him, unsure if this was some sort of test. "You don't eat dinner," she pointed out. "I do," he said. "Just not with other people." She tilted her head, suspicious. "So why now?" He didn't answer. Which meant he didn't know. Which meant, for once in his perfectly controlled life, he was just acting on instinct. She didn't question it. She was too tired to fight. So she got up, and she followed him. The dining room was set up for a full-course meal, as if the staff had been expecting them, though Sterling barely acknowledged it. He pulled out a chair for her, a small, practiced gesture that probably meant nothing, but for some reason, it made her chest tighten. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then, because silence made her antsy, she said, "So. Let me guess. You were one of those kids who always did extra credit even though you didn't need to." Sterling took a sip of wine, unbothered. "Obviously." She smirked. "Of course. Bet you color-coded your notebooks, too." He didn't deny it. She chewed slowly, studying him. "You're not really built for relationships, are you?" That got his attention. He set his glass down, lifting an eyebrow. "And you are?" She scoffed. "Definitely not. I pick emotionally unavailable men like it's an Olympic sport." That made him smirk, just barely. Naomi leaned back, twirling her fork between her fingers. "Okay, let's do something weird. Let's be honest." Sterling gave her a look. "I'm always honest." "No, you're not. You're polite. There's a difference." He exhaled through his nose, considering. Fine. What do you want to know? She tapped her fingers against the table. What's the worst thing anyone's ever said about you? His jaw tightened slightly. He looked at his wine glass like it might hold the answer. That I don't care about people. Naomi tilted her head. And is that true? He was quiet for a moment. I care in the ways I know how. It wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't the answer he expected, either. She didn't push. Instead, she gave him one of her own. The worst thing anyone's ever said about me? She forced a small smile. That I'm forgettable. His brows pulled together, something unreadable flashing across his face. You're not. The words came easily, like a fact. Naomi swallowed hard, glancing away. Yeah, well. Try telling that to the internet. Another silence stretched between them, but this time it didn't feel awkward. It felt like something shifting. They kept talking. About small things, big things, things that neither of them had ever bothered to say out loud before. By the time Naomi glanced at the clock, it was nearly 3 in the morning. She had spent an entire night talking to a man she never expected to understand. And somehow, against all odds, he had understood her too. The days after their long conversation slipped into a strange kind of ease. Naomi hadn't expected the change, but it was there. Sterling still maintained his usual distance, but now, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shift from being strangers forced into proximity to something more comfortable, something closer to companionship. It started with little things. Breakfasts that weren't filled with the sound of clinking silverware, but with short bursts of conversation. What book was she reading now? Did she enjoy the film she watched the other night? What did she think about that absurd CEO's new business venture? It wasn't the type of banter that built closeness overnight, but it was enough to soften the edges of their interaction. One morning, after a quiet but unhurried meal, Sterling surprised her by suggesting they watch a movie. Naomi blinked at him, unsure she had heard right. A movie? He nodded. Yeah. You seemed like you needed a distraction. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, taking in his serious expression. She had no idea what prompted this, but she was too curious to argue. Okay, but no documentaries on business, please. Promise. That night, they ended up in the living room, both seated on the plush sofa with no real plan, the TV screen blank between them. Naomi, ever the skeptic, pulled a blanket over her legs, casting a side eye at Sterling, who was now holding the remote like it was a weapon. She half expected him to pull up some obscure financial thriller that made people's heads spin. Instead, he queued up a science fiction movie. The kind where things exploded, heroes wore spandex suits, and the world was always on the brink of destruction. I'm assuming this is your idea of a good time? Naomi teased. Don't knock it till you try it, he replied. As the movie began, Naomi realized it wasn't just the action-packed plot that drew her in, it was the quiet ease of watching it with him. No forced smiles. No questions. Just two people sitting next to each other, sharing space, sharing time. It became a routine. Every couple of nights, they picked a movie, some mindless, others more thought-provoking. Naomi enjoyed picking films that made her laugh, ones with awkward humor, while Sterling gravitated toward complex, often emotionally fraught dramas. They rarely agreed on the movies, but that was part of the charm, arguing over whether the protagonist was a hero or a fool, or whether the ending was satisfying or a cop-out. The debates were small, but they made her feel like they were actually talking, instead of just existing in the same space. They fell into a rhythm, one that felt natural despite everything. Meals shared in the morning, coffee, toast, eggs. Her observations about the film, his dry commentary. Even conversations about their work started happening more frequently, though Naomi still wasn't entirely sure what Sterling actually did. It was mostly meetings, emails, contracts, and endless phone calls. But she stopped feeling like a ghost, watching from the outside. Instead, she started feeling like she belonged here. With him. And Sterling? She noticed the little things about him, too. The way he relaxed in the evenings, after a long day of being an infallible businessman, after meticulously controlling every aspect of his empire, he was still just a person. He could laugh, even if it was at himself. He could make fun of the absurdity of some of his business meetings, which Naomi found fascinating. He could admit when he was wrong, though that didn't happen often. They even started running into each other more, accidentally, of course, around the house. She'd be working late in the library, and he'd be passing by, usually heading somewhere for another late-night call or email session. There was an unspoken agreement now, something beyond the contract they had signed months ago. Naomi hadn't expected this. To feel, in some small way, seen. The isolation that had plagued her earlier was starting to break, piece by piece. And she knew, maybe it was naive to think so, but part of it was because of Sterling. One afternoon, he came into the kitchen where Naomi was trying to make a half-hearted attempt at cooking lunch. She wasn't great at it, but she'd learned enough in the past few weeks to not burn everything. "What are you making?" he asked, peeking over her shoulder. "Pasta," she answered, glancing back. "Well, attempting pasta. I don't think I can mess this up." Sterling raised an eyebrow. Famous last words. She rolled her eyes. "If you want a professionally made lunch, I suggest you find a restaurant." "Where's the fun in that?" He leaned against the counter, looking amused. "What's your secret to not burning everything?" "Keeping an eye on it and hoping for the best." "You've got guts, I'll give you that." His calm tone didn't help her nerves. She set the spoon down, facing him fully. "Seriously, though. I've got no idea what I'm doing." Sterling looked at her, his expression softening in a way she hadn't seen before. "You're doing fine." It wasn't much. It wasn't some grand statement. But for Naomi, it was enough. They sat down together to eat lunch, their conversation far from groundbreaking. But the simplicity of it, the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence, was all they needed. Later that night, Sterling casually mentioned a business meeting he had in another city. He'd be gone for the weekend. Naomi had never asked to know his schedule, never asked for details of his life outside their shared meals and occasional movie nights, but there was something about this particular trip that caught her attention. "Are you going alone?" she asked. His eyes flickered up from his phone, where he'd been reading some kind of report. He didn't seem surprised by the question, but he did seem to think for a second before answering. "Yes." "Good." She gave a small smile. "You should try to relax while you're there." Sterling's eyes softened, just a touch. "Maybe I will." It wasn't much, but it was enough. They didn't need to say more. The quiet understanding between them was, for the first time, comfortable. She had no expectations, no illusions. Just two people trying to navigate the weird, complicated world they had found themselves in. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was something. It was progress. And that felt like a victory. Naomi hadn't noticed it at first. How she actually liked being around him. How the silence between them had shifted from unbearable to comfortable, the kind that didn't require filling. She caught herself enjoying their conversations, looking forward to their late-night movie debates, their accidental run-ins in the kitchen when she was making a snack and he was returning from whatever endless meeting had kept him out. Sterling, in turn, had stopped treating her like furniture. He still wasn't warm, not exactly, but she could tell when he noticed her absence. The way his eyes flicked toward the library if she wasn't curled up in the armchair she had claimed as hers. The way he lingered a little longer in the kitchen when she was there, pretending he had something urgent to do but never actually leaving. She tested it once. Disappeared into the garden for a few hours just to see if he'd notice. When she came back inside, he looked up from his laptop, his expression blank but his voice giving him away. "Where were you?" She smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Did you miss me?" His lips twitched. "I just assumed you finally escaped." But later that night, when she settled into her usual spot across from him at dinner, she swore he looked relieved. Then, one evening, the inevitable happened. Naomi was coming downstairs when she saw one of the house staff whispering to another near the staircase. Their eyes darted towards Sterling's office door, their hushed tones laced with uncertainty. "Something wrong?" she asked, stepping closer. The older staff member hesitated before sighing. "Mr. Sinclair hasn't left his office since this morning. He wouldn't eat lunch, and he sent back his coffee untouched." Naomi frowned. "Okay, so? He works too much." "That's not exactly breaking news." The staff exchanged glances. He looked pale. "And he doesn't usually refuse caffeine." That was concerning. Sterling was a machine, yes, but even machines needed fuel. She walked to his office and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Pushing the door open, she found him sitting at his desk, head resting against his hand, looking miserable. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone, and his usual sharp focus had dulled at the edges. "You look terrible," she said. He barely lifted his head. "That's a lovely thing to say to your husband." She walked in, crossing her arms. "Are you sick?" "I'm fine." She reached out, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead before he could stop her. He was burning up. "Sterling, you have a fever." "I have emails." She let out a slow breath, trying not to strangle him. "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get up, go upstairs, and get into bed. And I'm going to make sure you don't die." "I'm not dying." Debatable. To her surprise, he didn't argue much after that. Whether it was exhaustion or the fever catching up to him, he let her help him upstairs, collapsing onto the bed with a groan. Naomi disappeared into the bathroom, rummaging through cabinets until she found something for his fever. When she returned, he had draped an arm over his eyes, clearly miserable. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding out the medicine. "Here. Take these." He peeked out from under his arm. "You don't have to do this." She rolled her eyes. "Yes, because letting you self-destruct sounds like a great plan." He took the pills, swallowing them with slow, deliberate sips of water. She pulled the covers over him, adjusting them so he was comfortable. "Do you ever take a break?" His eyes were half closed, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Not really." "Well, that's dumb." He huffed a quiet laugh, but then his brows furrowed. "Naomi?" "Yeah?" "You didn't have to stay." She hesitated. "I know." For a moment, the room was quiet except for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. Then, without thinking too much about it, she reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. He didn't pull away. The next morning, Naomi woke up in the chair beside his bed, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't remember falling asleep. And she definitely didn't remember him putting the blanket there. The email arrived in Naomi's inbox with all the warmth of an eviction notice. Final review of contract terms, Sinclair marriage agreement. She stared at it for a long time, her cursor hovering over the subject line. She knew what it would say. A reminder that her one-year arrangement with Sterling was coming to an end. That everything would be handled discreetly, that legal teams would ensure a seamless transition back to her real life, whatever that was. She should be relieved. This was what she had agreed to. Instead, she closed her laptop and pretended she hadn't seen it. The thing was, nothing in her day-to-day life felt temporary anymore. She had stopped flinching when she saw her name on mail delivered to the house. She no longer hesitated before setting her mug down on the kitchen counter without worrying about disrupting the pristine order of things. She had a preferred chair in the library, a usual seat at the dining table. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped feeling like a guest. And Sterling, he had changed, too. He wasn't affectionate, at least not in any overt way. He still moved through life with the same controlled precision, the same carefully structured days. But he was different with her. There was a softness now, even if it was subtle. She caught it in small moments. The way he poured her coffee in the morning without asking how she took it because he already knew. The way his eyes flicked toward her when she walked into a room, like he was instinctively checking that she was there. The way his hands lingered just a second longer when he passed her something, like he wasn't quite ready to let go. None of it meant anything. Except that it did. Naomi had spent her whole life convincing herself that she was good at leaving things behind. She had walked away from jobs, apartments, friendships that had faded into the background. She knew how to pack up and move on. So why did the thought of walking away from this feel so impossible? Harrison had his own theory. "You're making it weird," he said one evening, sprawled on the couch with a drink in his hand. Naomi, stretched out in the armchair across from him, raised an eyebrow. "I'm making what weird?" "This whole thing," he gestured vaguely. "You and my brother, pretending like you're still operating under a business contract when, clearly, it's something else now." She rolled her eyes. "We're not pretending anything." Harrison took a sip of his drink, watching her with far too much amusement. "Right. And that's why he's currently in the kitchen cutting fruit for you, because that's just a normal business arrangement activity." Naomi's stomach twisted. "He's not." She turned, and sure enough, Sterling was at the kitchen counter, slicing an apple with the same intensity he used in board meetings. Harrison smirked. "Too at ease, don't you think?" Naomi grabbed a throw pillow and chucked it at him. Harrison laughed, dodging it easily. "Just saying. Maybe you should start asking yourself some big, important questions before the lawyers show up with the paperwork." Naomi didn't respond. Because deep down, she already knew. The question wasn't if this felt real. It was whether either of them was ready to admit it. The office was too quiet. Naomi had been in here dozens of times before, usually for something trivial, like stealing one of Sterling's pens because they were weirdly perfect to write with, or sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone while he worked. But now, everything felt different. The air was thick, the silence pressing down on her as she stepped inside. Sterling was behind his desk, perfectly composed as always. A navy suit, crisp white shirt, tie slightly loosened like he'd had a long day, though she knew better. The man could be in the middle of an earthquake and still look like he had just stepped out of a high-end watch commercial. On the desk between them sat a single stack of papers. The divorce contract. Her fingers curled at her sides. This was what they had agreed to. A clean break. No messy endings, no drawn-out emotions. They had survived an entire year of marriage, successfully played their parts, avoided any major scandals, except for that one, but they'd gotten through it. This was the final step. She forced herself forward, even though her legs felt heavier than they should. Sterling didn't say anything. He just watched her, his gaze unreadable. She sat down in the chair across from him, the leather cool against the back of her legs. The pen sat neatly on top of the papers, like a perfect little invitation to undo everything they had built. Her fingers hovered over it, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she exhaled and said, "Well, this is weird." Sterling's lips twitched. A little. She let out a short, breathy laugh, but it didn't quite reach her chest. It shouldn't feel like this. It shouldn't feel like something was unraveling inside her, like the very air in the room had shifted into something fragile and breakable. This was always the plan. They had followed the rules, played the game, and now it was time to move on. So why did it feel like she was leaving something behind? Her fingers brushed the pen, but she still didn't pick it up. "You're being quiet," she said, looking up at him. "Not that I expected some grand farewell speech, but I don't know. I thought you'd at least tell me to hurry up so you can get to your next meeting." Sterling didn't respond right away. His hands were clasped on the desk, his jaw tight. Then, finally, he said, "There's no meeting." She blinked. He exhaled slowly, then reached for the papers. But instead of pushing them toward her, he hesitated. It was small, just a flicker of movement, a brief pause. But Naomi saw it. For the first time since she had stepped into his world, Sterling Sinclair looked uncertain. Her heart stumbled over itself. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She had come here to end something. So why did it feel like something else was beginning? Naomi sat across from Sterling in his office, the air between them thick with something she couldn't name. On the desk, where she had expected to see a neat stack of divorce papers, there was nothing. Just an empty stretch of polished wood, and Sterling, watching her with the kind of quiet intensity that made her stomach tighten. She had rehearsed this moment. She had told herself it was just a formality, a signature, a handshake, a polite goodbye. Instead, Sterling reached into his desk drawer and pulled out something small, something she definitely hadn't expected. A velvet box. Naomi's breath caught as he slid it across the desk, his fingers lingering on the edge for just a second before pulling away. "What is this?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Open it," he said. She hesitated, then picked it up, the weight of it foreign and heavy in her hands. When she flipped it open, a ring gleamed under the soft office light, delicate, timeless, undeniably beautiful. Her heart was beating too fast. "Sterling." He leaned back slightly, exhaling. "Would you prefer an alternative?" Naomi's mouth went dry. "An alternative to what? The divorce?" He nodded once, his expression unreadable. She couldn't speak. Couldn't think. This was not part of the plan. "I don't understand," she finally said. His jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "I don't want to go back to my life before you." She stared at him, trying to process the words. "Naomi." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "This past year, whatever it started as, it became something else." He gestured between them. "We became something else." Her hands curled around the edge of the ring box, her mind a mess of every conversation they had shared, every quiet moment, every stolen glance she had ignored because it was easier that way. "This isn't a business deal," he said. "It's not an obligation. And I'm not asking you because of a contract or some ridiculous family tradition." She swallowed hard. "Then why are you asking?" "Because I don't want to lose you." The room felt impossibly small, like all the air had been replaced with something too thick to breathe. She had spent the past year convincing herself this was temporary. That she had been playing a role, nothing more. But it wasn't just a role. She wanted this. She wanted him. She looked down at the ring, then back up at Sterling, her pulse hammering in her ears. And then she nodded. Sterling let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, like he had been holding something in and wasn't sure if he would ever get to let it go. He stood, stepping around the desk, holding his hand out. She took it without thinking, letting him pull her to her feet. "Let's do it right this time," he murmured. And so they did. The ceremony was small. No extravagant guest list, no media circus. Just them, Harrison making sarcastic remarks in the background, a quiet exchange of vows that actually meant something this time. As they walked out hand in hand, Naomi squeezed his fingers and laughed softly. "Guess I really did crash into my fate." Sterling shook his head, but there was a smile there, real and unguarded. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.